Have you ever wondered how a single man, armed with nothing but sheer genius and relentless ambition, could topple the mightiest empire the world had ever seen? What if I told you that Alexander the Great, a name that echoes through history, didn't just conquer Persia through brute force, but with a single brilliant strategy so audacious it still baffles historians today? Imagine standing on the edge of an ancient battlefield, the air thick with tension, soldiers' hearts pounding as they await a move that could decide the fate of millions. Today, we're about to dive deep into that very moment, the turning point where Alexander didn't just fight an empire, he outsmarted it. You're going to see Persia's vast armies, their generals, and even kings outmaneuvered by the cunning of one extraordinary mind. This isn't just history, it's a suspenseful story of strategy, risk, and audacity. But before we march onto the battlefield, here's a question for you. Could you have done what Alexander did if the weight of the world rested on your shoulders? Stick with me till the end, because every twist in this tale reveals lessons not only from history, but about the power of strategy, courage, and human brilliance. And now, let's step back in time and witness how one man's mind changed the course of an empire forever. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to face an army so vast that it seems the earth itself trembles beneath its weight? Picture this: tens of thousands of soldiers, horses, and chariots stretching across the horizon, all under the banner of the mighty Persian Empire. And against them, a young king barely 30, leading a force that, on paper, should have been crushed before the first arrow was loosed. That king was Alexander, and this was the moment that would test not just his courage, but the brilliance of his mind. The world knew Persia as untouchable, a colossus whose wealth, manpower, and sheer scale seemed insurmountable. Kings trembled at the mention of Darius III, and yet Alexander approached not with fear, but with calculation. His army, hardened by years of relentless campaigning, had already faced the icy plains of Thrace, the desert heat of Asia Minor, and the stubborn city-states of Greece. But Persia was different. Persia was a living, breathing force of unimaginable complexity, where every general, soldier, and chariot was a potential instrument of death. Alexander studied the battlefield like a chess master eyeing his opponent. He knew that brute strength alone would not win this war. He needed a strategy that would outthink Persia, outmaneuver it, and exploit the smallest weakness in an empire built on hubris and overconfidence. Every move had to be precise. One mistake, one misstep, and the thousands who trusted him might fall. But Alexander's mind thrived under pressure, his imagination carving paths where others saw walls. As the sun rose over the plains near Issus, the first sounds of drums, horns, and clashing armor began to echo across the valley. The Persian army stretched endlessly, their banners fluttering, their war cries rattling the very air. In contrast, Alexander's forces were compact, disciplined, and tightly controlled. His soldiers could almost feel the weight of history pressing down on them. They knew this battle could determine the fate of the known world. Yet even Alexander's closest generals were uneasy. Darius III was no ordinary opponent. He was a man who commanded armies by sheer presence, a king who could inspire loyalty and fear in equal measure. He had gathered the best of the Persian world, cavalry, archers, and the famed immortals, elite soldiers who had never known defeat. Every move Alexander planned would be scrutinized, tested, and possibly exploited, but then Alexander revealed the brilliance that would become legend. He did something no one expected. He did not immediately charge. Instead, he feigned calm, almost casual, allowing the Persian forces to stretch their lines, to overextend, to believe they had the advantage. His left flank was intentionally weakened, a risky maneuver that made it look vulnerable. Was this recklessness or genius? The Persians took the bait. They advanced with confidence, certain that Alexander was cornered, that victory was theirs before the first arrow had even flown. And then came the twist, the moment that turned the tide. Alexander, hidden from most eyes by a fold in the terrain, launched a sudden, devastating strike with his Companion Cavalry, hitting the Persian right flank at full speed. Horses thundered, armor clanged, and the precision of the attack tore through the lines like a knife through silk. The Persians, caught off guard, faltered. What seemed like an opening on Alexander's side was actually a trap, a carefully constructed illusion that drew Darius's attention away from the real danger. For a moment, the battlefield was chaos itself. Dust clouds obscured the sun, arrows zipped through the air, and shouts mixed with the groans of the wounded. Alexander, ever at the front, was everywhere at once, directing, inspiring, exploiting every crack in the enemy's formation. His mind raced faster than any sword could strike. This was not just a battle of strength. It was a battle of wits, timing, and psychological warfare. Yet, just as victory seemed within reach, a new complication emerged. Darius, seeing the collapse of his flank, retreated toward his chariots, signaling his reserves to counterattack. Alexander's troops, exhausted but unyielding, faced a choice: press forward and risk encirclement, or regroup and consolidate. In that tension-filled pause, the fate of empires hung in the balance. Every soldier could feel it, history itself waiting for a decision, waiting to be written. And then, just when it seemed Alexander had the upper hand, the Persian cavalry, hidden behind hills, charged unexpectedly. Horses screamed, archers unleashed a hail of arrows, and for the first time, Alexander's men hesitated. Was this the end of the young king's bold gambit? Or was it the opening for something even more audacious than anyone could imagine? The battlefield held its breath, and in that moment, Alexander made the decision that would define his legacy. But what he did next, the move that turned impending disaster into triumph, is a maneuver so brilliant it has been dissected by historians for centuries. One king, one strategy, one decisive moment that would echo through history, and yet, the world would not see it coming. As the sun dipped lower, the dust settled over the plains, leaving behind smoke, broken banners, and the trembling realization that something extraordinary had occurred. Alexander had gambled everything on a single strategy. Had he succeeded? Or would the Persian Empire crush him in the next turn of fate? We will return to this turning point in the next chapter, where the brilliance of Alexander's strategy unfolds fully, and where the true genius of the man who would be called great becomes terrifyingly clear. The question remains, how did one king, against impossible odds, manipulate an entire empire with nothing but strategy and daring? The answer lies just beyond the horizon, in a move so audacious that even today, it challenges everything we think we know about war. Could one man really outthink an entire empire? Could a single strategy turn certain defeat into a legend whispered across centuries? The sun was rising again over the plains where Alexander had planted his gamble, and the air was thick with tension, the kind that makes every heartbeat sound like a drum. His soldiers, weary but unbroken, looked to him not just for orders, but for the spark of certainty that only he seemed to possess. The Persians, sprawling and confident, were still reeling from the first strike of the young king's cunning. And yet, the real battle, the one that would decide the fate of kings, was only beginning. Darius III, once smug in his assumption that Alexander would falter, was beginning to understand that this young Macedonian was no ordinary adversary. He had seen the faltering of his own right flank, the shattering of formations that had once seemed impenetrable. And he knew that his empire's greatest strength, the sheer scale of its army, could also be its weakness. But how could one exploit that without risking annihilation? How could a king, standing on a field where every mistake was magnified, turn chaos to his advantage? Alexander's answer was audacious, almost reckless in its genius. He ordered his troops to pivot, to extend their left flank and create the illusion of vulnerability once more. The Persians, eager to exploit what they believed was a critical weakness, surged forward, their war cries echoing across the plains like thunder. Horses collided, swords clashed, and arrows zipped through the haze of dust and heat. For a moment it seemed as though the Persians would regain the upper hand, pressing against Alexander's lines with unstoppable force, but Alexander had anticipated this. Hidden behind the terrain, the Companion Cavalry waited, poised like a predator ready to strike. Then, with a single, precise command, the cavalry swept in with devastating speed, cutting through the Persian right flank as if it were paper. Soldiers who had been confident mere seconds before now found themselves facing death incarnate, and Darius's face, usually calm, betrayed the first flickers of panic. The battlefield itself seemed to shudder, as if sensing the shift in fate. Amid the chaos, something extraordinary happened. Alexander, noticing a gap forming in the Persian formation, rode forward personally, leading a small, elite unit to the fray. The Macedonians moved like a living blade, slicing through lines that should have been impregnable. Their precision, coordination, and sheer audacity left the Persians scrambling, trying to plug the holes faster than they could appear. Every turn, every feint, every unexpected move magnified the sense of suspense. Could one man's mind truly dominate an entire empire's army? And then the twist: Darius, realizing that his best soldiers were being isolated and destroyed, attempted a desperate maneuver. He signaled for his elite immortals to strike the Macedonian left flank, hoping to encircle Alexander's forces and trap them in a deadly vice. For a tense moment, the Persians' counterattack threatened to turn the tide. Horses screamed, dust rose like smoke from a fire, and Alexander's men found themselves on the brink of collapse. The young king's gamble, bold and brilliant though it was, teetered on the knife edge of disaster. In that instant, Alexander did something no one expected. He split his forces, sending a smaller contingent to lure the Persian cavalry deeper into a trap, while he himself led the main force in a sudden, daring charge directly at Darius. The battlefield seemed to freeze for a heartbeat as the two leaders, separated by thousands of men, became the pivot around which the fate of empires would turn. The Macedonians pressed forward, the Persians recoiling, and for the first time, Darius faced the horrifying possibility that retreat might be his only option. But Alexander was not yet finished. With every calculated step, he applied psychological pressure as well as physical. His forces shouted, beat their shields, and moved in ways designed to amplify the chaos, to make the Persian soldiers doubt what they saw. This was not just war. It was a performance, a masterful manipulation of fear and perception. The Persians faltered, not simply because of skill or courage, but because Alexander controlled the narrative of the battle itself. Every second, every movement, was a question posed to his enemy. Are you brave enough to fight? Or are you clever enough to retreat before it's too late? And then came the climax. Darius, witnessing his army crumble in front of him, mounted his chariot and fled. The sheer shock of a king abandoning his own forces sent waves of panic through the Persian lines. Soldiers who had once marched with confidence now turned and ran, leaving behind weapons, banners, and their belief in invincibility. Alexander, seeing the moment, pressed forward relentlessly, not to kill, but to solidify the psychological victory. By the time the Macedonian forces stopped, the battlefield was strewn with chaos. Yet Alexander remained in control, his mind unbroken. His strategy proven beyond doubt, yet even in triumph, questions remained. How would Alexander consolidate his victory? Could he hold the territory he had won, or would the Persian heartland rise again to challenge him? And more importantly, what had this battle revealed about the nature of warfare itself, about the power of strategy over sheer numbers? The answers were not simple, and Alexander knew that one brilliant victory did not guarantee the fall of an empire. The Persian threat was not extinguished. It had only been delayed, manipulated, and exposed for what it truly was, vulnerable to audacity, precision, and genius. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the battlefield, Alexander rode among his soldiers, surveying the scene. The dead and wounded of both armies lay scattered, a grim testament to the stakes of ambition. Yet, in that moment, there was triumph, yes, but also uncertainty. The victory was monumental, yet the war was far from over. Somewhere, in the heart of Persia, Darius plotted his next move. And Alexander, for all his brilliance, knew that the true test of his strategy had only just begun. In the quiet that followed the storm, a single question lingered over the plains. Could one man truly control the fate of an empire with strategy alone? Or was this just the calm before an even greater storm? The answer, the next twist, and the full revelation of Alexander's genius lie just ahead, in a move so daring that it would reshape the ancient world forever. Have you ever wondered what happens after a battlefield falls silent, when victory has been claimed but the war is far from over? The plains of Issus were littered with the remnants of one of history's most audacious confrontations. Smoke curled over the horizon, mingling with the cries of survivors, while Alexander rode among his men, surveying the scene with eyes sharp as a hawk. He did not celebrate. He understood that triumph on the field was only the beginning. Winning a battle was one thing. Conquering an empire, bending it to his will, was another challenge entirely. The Macedonians, exhausted and bloodied, could barely comprehend the scale of what they had achieved. Against impossible odds, they had shattered the Persian army and forced Darius III into retreat. Yet the silence that followed carried an uneasy weight. Soldiers began to murmur among themselves. The Persians were not destroyed. They were wounded, yes, humiliated, yes, but still alive. Somewhere to the east, a king watched the news unfold, plotting his return with vengeance that could eclipse what Alexander had just accomplished. Alexander, however, was already thinking 5 steps ahead. He knew that his advantage lay not just in the battlefield, but in the mind of his enemy. Darius's retreat was more than a flight. It was an opening. An empire so vast could not respond instantly, and every delay, every hesitation could be exploited. Alexander's brilliance shone in these moments between victories. Where other generals would have rested, he mapped the terrain, studied enemy patterns, and calculated the next strike. Every decision, from supply lines to troop morale, became a chess move in a game whose stakes were the fate of empires. The Macedonian soldiers, seeing Alexander ride tirelessly among them, felt a mixture of awe and fear. His energy seemed inexhaustible, his mind operating at a speed no mortal could match. When he spoke, it was not with commands alone, but with stories, with visions of glory that made men feel part of something greater than themselves. They followed him not merely out of duty, but out of belief in the impossible made tangible through a single leader's courage and intellect. Meanwhile, Darius faced a crisis of confidence. For the first time in his life, he realized that the threat Alexander posed was not just physical, but psychological. Persia's soldiers, who had always followed orders unquestioningly, were now doubting. His generals argued among themselves. The army that once seemed invincible now showed cracks in loyalty and morale. And Alexander, thousands of miles away, was already exploiting them, and yet, the true genius of Alexander's strategy was about to reveal itself in a way no one could predict. While Darius regrouped and attempted to marshal forces for a counterattack, Alexander pursued an audacious plan. He would not merely follow the Persians. He would invade the heart of their empire while it was still destabilized. This was the moment where strategy became audacity, and audacity became legend. Crossing rivers, mountains, and hostile territories, Alexander moved with speed and precision that astounded historians for centuries. Every city he encountered was carefully assessed. Diplomacy, intimidation, and calculated force were wielded in equal measure along the way. Small but telling incidents underscored the young king's brilliance. A city prepared to resist him. He offered a single, clever compromise, securing surrender without a single life lost. A supply line threatened by bandits. He devised a feint that turned potential disaster into reinforcement. Each maneuver was a testament to the idea that wars are won not just by battles, but by controlling the space between them, by turning obstacles into advantages before the enemy even recognizes them, and yet suspense lingered. Alexander's men began to wonder, could they really sustain this relentless pace? Could an army, fatigued and stretched across unfamiliar lands, hold its momentum against an empire as vast as Persia? Every day brought new risks, disease, starvation, treachery. The Macedonian king, however, seemed untouchable and vulnerable not through armor, but through mind. And this, in itself, created tension. The soldiers, and even his generals, could not predict the next move, which was precisely Alexander's point. Predictability, he knew, was a weakness no great commander could afford. Then came a moment of unexpected peril. A Persian force, thought scattered and retreating, launched a sudden ambush on Alexander's flank. Macedonian soldiers, exhausted from days of pursuit, found themselves facing a well-prepared, disciplined enemy. Horses reared, swords clashed, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, it seemed that Alexander's campaign might falter. But here was the twist. He had anticipated this possibility. From his vantage point, he signaled a maneuver so counterintuitive that even seasoned generals hesitated to believe it could succeed. With precision timing, he redirected his forces, luring the Persians into a trap and neutralizing them before they could mount a sustained attack. Victory was regained, but the tension, the uncertainty of the campaign's continuation remained palpable. By the time Alexander reached the gates of the Persian heartland, the stakes had shifted from battlefield tactics to empire-level strategy. Darius, increasingly desperate, realized that Alexander's brilliance could not be measured in hours or days. It operated on a scale of weeks and months, exploiting vulnerabilities that seemed invisible to ordinary minds. The young king was no longer just a conqueror. He was an architect of inevitability, turning every obstacle into an opportunity and every hesitation into leverage. Yet, even in this extraordinary momentum, the story was far from over. As Alexander's forces prepared for what many believed would be the final confrontation, a new, unexpected complication arose. Intelligence reached him that a Persian general, previously thought loyal, was preparing a secret alliance with distant satraps, planning to strike from the rear while Alexander was engaged at the front. The possibility of betrayal sent a ripple of suspense through the Macedonian ranks. Could the empire's defenses, already weakened, rebound at the precise moment that Alexander seemed unstoppable? And there, on the edge of what should have been a straightforward march to ultimate victory, the campaign paused. Alexander's mind raced with options. Every move now carried consequences far beyond the battlefield. The Macedonians, following without question, felt the tension like a living thing. Persia's heartland waited in silent anticipation, a landscape of cities, rivers, and armies that might either fall in awe or rise in fury. The cliffhanger, unspoken but omnipresent, was clear. Would Alexander's audacity and strategic genius be enough to finally topple Darius and claim the Persian Empire? Or was the empire quietly regrouping, preparing a final, devastating counter that could undo everything? The answer lay just ahead, in the confrontation that would define history itself, the next move, the next battle, and the final test of a strategy so brilliant it had never been attempted before. Have you ever watched a storm approach, knowing it could either cleanse everything in its path or tear everything apart? That is what Persia felt as Alexander advanced deeper into its heartland. The Macedonian army, though tired, moved with a precision and confidence that defied logic. Every step, every decision radiated the quiet, terrifying brilliance of a man whose mind saw possibilities where others saw walls. Alexander was no longer merely chasing Darius. He was orchestrating a symphony of strategy, a game in which Persia itself was being maneuvered like a piece on a chessboard. The cities of Anatolia and Mesopotamia had already felt his presence, yet now the stakes were higher. Each town, each citadel could either provide sanctuary and supplies or resist and bleed his army. Alexander approached not as a conqueror rushing blindly into foreign lands, but as a strategist, weighing risk, anticipating betrayal, and calculating the exact moment when audacity would tip into inevitability. He understood that the heart of Persia was more than Darius. It was a web of governors, generals, and mercenaries, each capable of turning a seemingly small skirmish into disaster. And then the unexpected happened. News reached him that Darius had regrouped near the banks of a wide, twisting river. The Persian king had managed to rally additional forces from the eastern satraps, sending thousands of reinforcements to block Alexander's advance. For a fleeting moment, the Macedonians felt the same tension that had gripped the Persians at Issus. Could Alexander's brilliance withstand an army larger, better supplied, and desperate for redemption? Could one mind outmaneuver another, even when the stakes had multiplied exponentially? Alexander, however, thrived on such moments. He studied the river, the surrounding hills, and the positioning of the Persian army. Then he did what he had become known for. He devised a plan so audacious that even his closest generals held their breath. He would not confront the Persian army head-on, where their numerical advantage could overwhelm him. Instead, he orchestrated a feint, leaving a seemingly exposed left flank, while maneuvering the bulk of his forces to strike the Persian center with deadly precision. It was the same principle that had worked at Issus but magnified, honed, and executed with relentless timing. The day of the confrontation arrived. The river banks were alive with tension, the hum of armor, the neighing of horses, and the silent prayers of men who knew that history itself watched over them. Darius's army spread like a living wall across the plains, confident in their defensive advantage. Alexander's forces, disciplined and alert, advanced slowly, deliberately, every movement designed to draw the Persians into overextension. And then, at the precise moment, Alexander unleashed the first strike, sending cavalry to envelop the Persian wings while infantry pressed the center. Chaos erupted. Horses screamed, the air filled with the clash of steel, and arrows darkened the sky. But Alexander remained in control, riding through the melee with a composure that inspired awe. Each move he made seemed to anticipate his enemy's instincts. When the Persians tried to plug gaps, he opened new ones. When they advanced, he created traps that left them isolated. The battle was no longer merely physical, it was psychological, a test of wit as much as strength. And then came the twist. A hidden contingent of Persian mercenaries, thought to have been neutralized in previous campaigns, emerged from a hill to strike Alexander's rear. The Macedonian soldiers, though disciplined, were momentarily stunned. The ambush threatened to turn a brilliant assault into catastrophe. But Alexander, in a display of instantaneous calculation, redirected part of his cavalry to intercept the threat while simultaneously pushing the main attack forward. The result was staggering. The ambush was neutralized, and the Persians found themselves trapped between two relentless forces. By mid-afternoon, the turning point became undeniable. Darius, once again confronted with the collapse of his army, mounted his chariot and attempted to flee. The psychological effect on his troops was devastating. Soldiers who had been trained to follow orders without question now wavered. Commanders shouted, cavalry faltered, and the illusion of invincibility evaporated. Alexander's genius lay not just in tactics, but in timing, the precise moment when fear could be leveraged to collapse an empire's cohesion without annihilating it entirely. Yet even as victory loomed, suspense remained. Alexander had achieved battlefield superiority, but the heart of Persia was vast, its cities sprawling and its wealth immense. Could he maintain control over the territory he had just claimed? Would Darius, though defeated on the plains, rise again in a final, desperate gamble that could undo months of brilliant campaigning? Every general in Alexander's army understood the precariousness of the moment. Triumph on the field was one thing. Securing an empire demanded foresight, cunning, and relentless courage. The climax of Part 4 arrived when Alexander, surveying the shattered Persian lines, realized that Darius's final escape route could be blocked, but only if he acted instantly. With breathtaking decisiveness, he led a small but elite force in a dash across the plain, cutting off the Persian king from the road to safety. Horses thundered, dust rose like smoke from fire, and the two forces collided in a moment of pure suspense. Alexander's gamble was audacious, too audacious, some might have thought, but it worked. Darius, confronted by the inevitability of capture, fled into the mountains, leaving his army in disarray, and yet the story did not end there. As Alexander's forces regrouped and the Persian army scattered, a new tension arose. Intelligence reported that hidden Persian reserves, loyal only to Darius's name, were mobilizing farther east. These forces, if they arrived before Alexander consolidated his hold, could strike a decisive blow, turning the hard-won victory into another grueling battle. The Macedonians understood the implications immediately. The war for Persia was far from over, and Alexander's genius would be tested again, perhaps in ways no one could predict as the sun set over the plains. Casting long, ominous shadows, Alexander rode among his soldiers, his mind racing with plans for the next phase. He had won the battle, outsmarted Darius, and proven his brilliance once more, but the Persian Empire was not a defeated kingdom yet. The real test, the ultimate challenge of strategy and audacity, awaited him just beyond the horizon. The cliffhanger was clear. Could Alexander's genius, proven on the battlefield, withstand the full scale of Persia itself? Could one man truly bend an empire to his will, or would the vastness, the complexity, and the cunning of Persia reveal weaknesses even he could not anticipate? The answer, the final twist, and the ultimate revelation of a strategy so brilliant it would echo through history were yet to come, and the world would watch as one man attempted the impossible. Have you ever wondered what it takes to not just win a battle, but to topple an empire? To step onto the stage of history and bend the fate of millions with a single, audacious plan? Alexander now stood at that very threshold. The plains before him were littered with the remnants of Persian resistance, yet the heart of Darius's empire, the capital, the wealth, the very symbol of his power still waited. And Alexander, brilliant, daring, and unrelenting, knew that here, in this vast expanse, strategy would matter more than courage, more than force. The Persian king had regrouped, but only partially. His forces, though scattered, retained discipline and loyalty in pockets. Alexander understood that to succeed, he could not simply attack. He had to manipulate, outthink, and strike where his enemy least expected. Every city he approached, every river he crossed, was part of a grander plan, a plan that would turn perception itself into a weapon. He moved swiftly, choosing routes that allowed flexibility, sending detachments to secure supply lines, while keeping his main army poised for the decisive blow. And then it came, the moment of ultimate audacity. Alexander orchestrated a maneuver so cunning that it would be remembered for centuries. He feigned a retreat on one flank, drawing Persian forces into pursuing what seemed like a vulnerable Macedonian army. But it was a trap, crafted with meticulous care. As the Persians advanced, believing they had the upper hand, Alexander's elite units struck from hidden positions, cutting off escape routes and isolating enemy contingents. Panic spread like wildfire. Horses reared, soldiers shouted in confusion, and the seemingly endless Persian army fractured under pressure it could not anticipate. The twist, however, was personal. Darius, realizing his empire's fate hung by a thread, attempted one final gambit. He mounted his chariot and charged directly at Alexander, hoping to strike the young king down and rally his forces. For a heartbeat, the Macedonian soldiers held their breath. Could Alexander, already legendary for his speed and audacity, survive this moment? Could one man withstand the fury of a desperate king backed by the remnants of an empire? But Alexander had anticipated even this. With a combination of precise timing and sheer audacity, he met Darius's charge not with fear, but with a calculated counterattack. The Persian king's chariot was intercepted, his forces surrounded, and the psychological blow was devastating. Soldiers who had followed him without question now wavered. The aura of invincibility crumbled. Darius fled, leaving behind the treasury, his generals, and the remnants of his once mighty army. Alexander's brilliance had turned panic into victory, audacity into inevitability, and yet, even in triumph, suspense remained. Alexander did not celebrate immediately. He understood that conquering an empire required more than defeating armies, it required consolidating power, managing cities and winning the loyalty of people who had long believed they were ruled by invincible kings. Each decision now carried enormous stakes. Every move could inspire allegiance or provoke rebellion. His mind, relentless and strategic, worked tirelessly, anticipating resistance before it could arise, turning potential chaos into controlled dominance. As the Macedonian army moved through the heart of Persia, the psychological dimension of Alexander's strategy became clear. He treated conquered cities with a mix of respect, diplomacy, and intimidation. He allowed governors to maintain positions if they swore loyalty, punished only the stubborn, and used his growing legend to inspire fear as much as admiration. Each encounter was carefully calibrated, a demonstration of power, yes, but also a lesson in the brilliance of strategy over brute force. The climax of this campaign was breathtaking in its audacity. Alexander, facing scattered but determined Persian forces, executed a simultaneous multi-pronged strike: cavalry to cut off escape routes, infantry to press the center, and strategic feints that drew the remaining Persian forces into traps. It was as if the battlefield itself were a stage, and Alexander the conductor of a symphony of war. Every soldier, every general, every city became a note in a composition so precise that, Resistance collapsed under the weight of brilliance alone, yet the final twist lingered. Darius, though defeated, had escaped once more, retreating to distant lands with a remnant of his army. Alexander, understanding the symbolic power of capturing a king, faced a choice: pursue and risk overextension, or consolidate and claim Persia through strategy, intimidation, and control. Once again he chose audacity. He pressed forward, cutting off supply lines, seizing strategic cities, and using intelligence networks to anticipate every move. Within months, the Persian Empire was effectively in his hands, not merely through conquest, but through an intricate blend of strategy, foresight, and psychological mastery. As Alexander finally entered the capital, the scope of his achievement became clear. The wealth, the cities, and the symbols of Persian authority now lay before him, subdued not only by force but by intellect. The empire had fallen not because of numbers, but because one man had thought differently, acted decisively, and gambled boldly where others hesitated. It was a triumph that would echo through history. And yet the cliffhanger remained. Even in ultimate victory, the question loomed: could Alexander maintain control over such a vast empire? Could his brilliance withstand the pressures of governance, rebellion, and the human cost of relentless conquest? The conquest of Persia was complete, yes, but the real story, the human story of ambition, strategy, and legacy, was far from over. The audience was left with the awe-inspiring truth: Alexander had conquered the mightiest empire of his time with a single, brilliant strategy, but the next challenge, greater than any battlefield, awaited him still. Have you ever wondered what it truly means to conquer an empire? Not just to win a battle or topple a king, but to bend the destiny of millions, to imprint your mind on the course of history itself? Alexander now stood at the pinnacle of his achievement. Persia, the mightiest empire the world had ever known, had fallen. The cities were in his hands, the armies scattered, and the symbols of power palaces, treasures, and crowns now belonged to a man whose name would echo for millennia. Yet even in this triumph, Alexander's mind raced, restless and insatiable. Victory was never the end. It was the doorway to the next challenge. The Macedonian army, though exhausted, looked to him with reverence and fear. They had seen impossible feats unfold before their eyes. Entire armies shattered, kings fleeing, and cities submitting without a fight. And yet they understood what their leader understood. Conquering Persia was not simply a matter of swords and spears, but of vision. Alexander's genius lay in seeing patterns where others saw chaos, opportunities where others saw threats, and paths to victory that no one else could imagine. But the human cost of this brilliance was not lost on him. The plains of Issus, the river banks, the gates of Persepolis, they were littered with the remnants of men who had followed orders, believed in kings, or simply fought for survival. Alexander felt the weight of each life, the weight of every decision that had turned so many fates into a story of triumph. And yet he could not pause. To conquer an empire required decisiveness, even ruthlessness, and a clarity of mind that few could maintain. The consolidation of Persia became a masterclass in strategic foresight. Alexander did not simply impose Macedonian rule. He integrated, adapted, and manipulated. Local governors who pledged loyalty were kept in place. Cities that resisted were punished, and alliances were carefully nurtured to ensure stability. Intelligence, communication, and rapid decision-making became as important as the sword. He understood that controlling an empire was not merely about battles. It was about perception, trust, and the careful orchestration of power. And yet, suspense remained, even in victory. Rumors of Darius's survival circulated among the cities. Whispers of uprisings and hidden loyalists reached Alexander's ears. Could a single man maintain control over lands so vast, over cultures so diverse, over soldiers whose loyalty had been tested by fire? History had never seen an empire like this, and Alexander, as brilliant as he was, faced challenges that no battlefield strategy could fully prepare him for. The tension was no longer external. It was woven into the very fabric of empire, demanding foresight, patience, and intellect beyond the ordinary. Then came the twist of legacy. Alexander, aware of the limits of brute force, began to cement his image as more than a conqueror. He allowed Persian traditions to continue, adopted elements of local governance, and cultivated a narrative that made his rule appear both inevitable and legitimate. By blending Macedonian authority with Persian culture, he ensured that the empire he had conquered would not rise immediately against him. This was strategy on a level beyond any battlefield, a psychological and cultural conquest that secured power without continuous war. As the sun set over Persepolis, casting golden light across the city's grand architecture, Alexander paused to reflect. He had achieved what few could imagine. A single, brilliant strategy had toppled an empire, changed the course of history, and etched his name into legend. And yet, he knew this was only the beginning. Empires are living entities. They breathe, resist, and evolve. To rule was to anticipate the next challenge, to turn foresight into action, and to balance audacity with prudence. The final suspense lingered. Could any man truly master an empire so vast, so complex, and so alive with its own ambitions? Alexander had proven that brilliance could overcome even the mightiest armies, that audacity could topple kings, and that strategy could conquer what force alone could never touch. Yet the human element, the unpredictability of loyalty, ambition, and rebellion remained a challenge even he could not fully control, and this, perhaps, is the ultimate lesson of Alexander's conquest of Persia. It is a story not just of armies and battles, but of mind over matter, courage over fear, and audacity over convention. A story that reminds us that one man, armed with vision and brilliance, can indeed change the course of history, but that every victory carries the seeds of the next challenge. As night fell over the Persian Empire, Alexander's gaze swept across the land he had conquered. The world had changed forever, and yet the story was far from complete. The young king's journey, marked by genius, audacity, and unyielding ambition, had rewritten what it meant to conquer. And somewhere in the distance, the next test awaited the ultimate proof that history favors not just the strong, but the cunning, the bold, and the relentless.